When Excel 2010 was introduced, Excel's pivot tables and pivot charts got a pair of new features for filtering: the slicer for text data and the timeline for date-related info. We've looked at the slicer, so now we'll give the timeline a try. Having opened this file with a fairly big block of data, we'll go ahead and create a pivot table. Since this block contains date information, the use of a timeline type filter would make sense here. We can start by going to the Insert tab, and over here in the Tables group we can give the button for the pivot table a click. We can go with the defaults on this, make life easy, and just click OK down at the bottom. Now we're being asked to put the fields in the appropriate places, so I'll start by grabbing employee ID and putting that in the column space. We can grab the order amounts and drag those to the value space, and then we can break down that information a little further by putting the ship country in the row space. Now we have a fairly decent pivot table. The next step would normally be to insert a date-related field in either the rows or the columns area. I'll drag the divider up a little bit so we can make it a little bit easier here. And I'll go ahead and drag order date into the row space under ship country. But when we do this, the pivot table builder subdivides the order date by various intervals: years, quarters, months, and finally the individual days, as we can see here. And that means that the pivot table gets a little more complicated, gets significantly larger in fact, and it might take some of the bottom line usefulness away from the purpose of the table if we have to go doing a lot of expanding of years and quarters and months and so on. So to simplify things, we'll remove these fields and then check out how the timeline works by comparison. We can go to the pivot table field list, uncheck years, quarters, months, scroll up a bit, and uncheck order dates as well, bringing the pivot table back to its original structure. If we go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and take a look in the filter group here, we can click on Insert Timeline, and the program will then ask, as it does with slicers, which field do we want to base the timeline on? Well, we can use order date even though it isn't currently in the pivot table. It doesn't matter. We can filter by something which has not been put in the pivot table because it's in the original block of data. So we check the check mark for order date, click OK at the bottom of the box, and the timeline appears. We can just push it over wherever we want it. We can grab any of the sizing handles, make it wider, narrower if we wish, and now we can see that it's possible to scroll through time to get to whichever period we're interested in. If we click a month where we know we have some sales, say November of 2006, we immediately filter for that piece of information. This particular block of data has no orders earlier than July of 06 or later than May of 08, so we just have to be careful, if we know the span of time for the orders, not to select a month or a period where there's no information. Otherwise, of course, we filter everything out. The timeline also lets us change the interval. We can go up here and click the drop down for the interval and go to years, or quarters, or months, or individual days if we like, and then click on whichever day, go to months, click on whichever month, and so on. And just as with slicers, and this is the key thing, if we go to the File tab and we tell the program that we want to print, and then navigate over to the second piece of paper here, the timeline shows up just like the slicer does, and therefore we can tell what we are filtering for date-wise. If we want to add a slicer specifically, in addition to a timeline, very easy. We can just click somewhere in the pivot table, go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, as we've already done, click the button for inserting a slicer, and we can add a slicer for something which is in the pivot table or not, as we see fit. If we check the check mark for employee ID and click OK, we can now go ahead and use both to filter for a given month and a given employee. If we want to unfilter on either or both, we click the Clear Filter button at the top right of either. And as before with the slicer, if we want to delete either the slicer or the timeline, click its name and hit the delete key on the keyboard, and away it goes. Any number of slicers and timelines is permitted, though we want to be careful not to overdo it and filter everything out. The filter feature in the PivotTable field list is a useful one, but the timelines and slicers give us a couple more tools in the toolbox, which never hurts.